visceral motor, right? This is visceral motor. So what is visceral? Organs, internal organs. And we're going to throw in glands here. Okay. Internal organs and glands. So this is going to be cardiac muscle, smooth muscle, and glands that we're going to control with our autonomic nervous system. Okay? And we've got, this is going to travel on an efferent pathway. Remember, E is exiting the brain, right? CNS to muscles and glands, right? And this is controlled at the subconscious level, right? You cannot think your heart to beat faster. You cannot control the rate that food is moving through your gastrointestinal system. So this is involuntary, subconscious regulation of visceral activities. Cardiac, smooth muscle, glands, right? We're now going to separate it into two divisions, right? We're going to have the sympathetic and the parasympathetic. Sympathetic, anytime you're dealing with, if I'm asking you questions about the sympathetic nervous system, right? This is your emergency system, fight or flight. So you want to be thinking about being attacked by a shark. If I am attacked by a shark, what is going to happen to my blood pressure? If I am attacked by a shark, what is going to happen to my heart rate? Go up, right? Both of those will go up. Do you want more or less oxygen coming into your skeletal muscle if you are being attacked by a shark? You want more, because you want to run away, swim away, get away, right? So more oxygen coming in. So what's going to happen to your respiratory rate? It's going to go up. What about visual information? Do you want more visual information or less visual information? Well, more of being attacked by a shark. I want to see how I'm going to exit, right? So what's going to happen to your pupils? They're going to dilate, right? So that's how you want to think about this. You want to think about being attacked by a shark. What's going to happen to this? You know, are you going to be thinking about what you're going to have for lunch? No, right? So GI tract, not dealing with that, right? You're not going to speed up information. You're not going to digest food, right? Your parasympathetic is your rest and digest, right? Rest and digest. This is you after Thanksgiving dinner, right? You have just eaten 4 turkeys, 8 pies, right? Sweet potatoes, and you are curled up on the couch ready to watch football for the next 18 hours, right? Right? So what happens to secretions of the stomach? Increase. What happens to motility of the small intestine? Increase. Food's going through, so defecation, urination, increase. Right? What about heart rate? Slows down. Blood pressure? Down. Okay? So this is your, I just eaten Thanksgiving meal and I'm going to curl up and hibernate. Right? So when you're thinking about those divisions, you want to think about function that way. All right. So here's our 2 motor pathways. We've got our somatic nervous system. Somatic was not internal organs, so that's skeletal muscle, right? Here's our autonomic nervous system, visceral effectors, smooth muscles, glands, cardiac, right? And again, both of these are efferent pathways. Both are exiting the brain, CNS to CNS. All right? Now, the autonomic nervous system is set up somewhat differently. Here we simply have lower motor neurons going in and innervating skeletal muscle. Right? We have our upper motor neurons that we see at the CNS. Lower motor neurons are going out to the periphery. In our autonomic nervous system, we actually have what are called preganglionic neurons and postganglionic neurons, and then our ganglion. Right? And you should have seen some of that in lab last time. You talk about the sympathetic chain ganglion, right? Bulges where you have the synapse occurring, right? So we're going to look at that in detail, right? But you do have preganglionic neuron, the ganglion, and a postganglionic neuron. Right? So somatic, we're going to innervate skeletal muscle. Headquarters, the cerebral cortex. Which part of the cerebral cortex is the headquarters for the somatic motor nervous system? Precentral gyrus, right? Our motor cortex. Feedback, we're going to get feedback through the cerebellum and the basal nuclei. Why do I know we have feedback through these structures? These are motor structures, right? Right? ANS, autonomic nervous system, the effectors are cardiac muscle, smooth muscle, and glands, headquartered in the hypothalamus. Right? Do you remember when we were talking about functions in the hypothalamus? Hypothalamus collects visceral sensory information and sends out visceral motor information. Okay? So if I'm laying down and I jump up very quickly, right? What will the visceral sensory is going to send in saying you need to pump blood to the brain. You're now upright, so you have to pump. It takes greater effort to pump blood against gravity than it is when you're laying flat. So the hypothalamus would adjust to that. It's going to send out visceral motor commands to deal with that drop in blood pressure that occurs when you went from laying down to standing up. You guys ever been to the dentist office where they want you to stand up quickly when you're at the dentist office? So they say, take your time getting up. Don't stand up too quickly, right? It gives time for the hypothalamus to adjust blood pressure as you're going from laying down to standing up. Limbic system, thalamus, provide feedback to the autonomic nervous system. Okay, so here is a beautiful diagram of the autonomic nervous system, right? We said that the autonomic nervous system has two neurons that you need to be aware of. Right? Here is our preganglionic neuron, and here's our postganglionic neuron. Right? This is our parasympathetic nervous system. Right? Do you know why I need that? Right? Look where our preganglionic neuron is originating from. What's the most important parasympathetic neuron that we've talked about so far? Cranial nerve? 10. Vagus. Remember the vagus nerve? Right? Right? Husband has vasovagal syncope, passing out all the time, right? Cranial nerve 10 implies it is coming from the brain, right? So I know automatically this is parasympathetic nervous system. Parasympathetic nervous system comes from the brain and the sacral region of the central nervous system. The other thing that gives this away is my preganglionic neuron is incredibly long. It is actually going to be very close to the effector before I get the ganglion. Okay? Where was the sympathetic chain ganglion located? If you were telling your mailman where to look for a sympathetic chain ganglion, where would you tell him to look? Is it going to be at an effector? Where is it located? Right by the spinal cord, right? Right by the spinal cord. So this spinal cord, ganglion is located right next to it, very short. Okay? And that synapse occurs. All right, so sympathetic mainly comes from the thoracic and lumbar region. Right? Here we've got a long preganglionic. Here we've got a very short preganglionic neuron, right? Different sizes, structured differently. Okay? Then we've got a long postganglionic neuron and a very short postganglionic neuron. Very short, very long. Okay? Now, let's talk about the neurotransmitters that are used at each of these locations. So the easy thing is that the neurotransmitter that's used at the ganglion is the same for both systems. You learn that, you can't get it wrong, right? They're the same. So this neuron releases acetylcholine. This neuron releases acetylcholine. Both of them release the same neurotransmitter at the ganglion. Okay? The receptors are the same as well. Right? So our receptors that bind to acetylcholine are going to be the same. These are called nicotinic receptors. And that should sound familiar because they're the same receptors that you have on skeletal muscle. What did the motor neuron release for its neurotransmitter? Acetylcholine, right? They're going to bind to nicotinic receptors. It's the same. So this is the same so far as we talked about for skeletal muscle. Okay? So we know, what is the sympathetic nervous system going to do to the heart? Is it going to make the heart rate go up or down? Up. What about the parasympathetic? What's that going to do to the heart? Go down, slow it down. So we know the neurotransmitter at the heart has to be different because these two things produce different effects, right? So we can't use the same neurotransmitter, otherwise you're going to get the same effect. Okay? So the parasympathetic nervous system uses acetylcholine. Okay? The receptors on the heart are not nicotinic. These are called muscarinic. All right? So we have muscarinic receptors on the heart that bind to acetylcholine. And I'm going to come back to the receptors later, so we're going to cover that in great detail later. Okay? Our sympathetic nervous system has to release a different neurotransmitter onto the heart. Right? So it is going to release what's called norepinephrine, right? Which is a derivative of epinephrine, which is the same thing as adrenaline. What does adrenaline do to heart rate? Speeds it up. Okay? I'm going to talk about the receptors located here at a different time, right? But it can have receptors to bind norepinephrine. So these two neurotransmitters are what gives you the different effects. Is everyone okay with that? These two will give you the different effects. If we put acetylcholine on the heart, what's that going to do to the heart? Slow it down. If we put norepinephrine on the heart, speed it up. Different effects because these are different. These, same. Action potential travels down here. Get acetylcholine released. Acetylcholine binds to nicotinic receptors. Action potential travels down here. Norepinephrine is released. Action potential travels down our preganglionic neuron here. Acetylcholine is released, binds to our nicotinic receptors, generating an action potential here. Action potential travels down. This postganglionic neuron releases acetylcholine, which is different than norepinephrine. Everyone okay? Okay. So, what we're now going to do is talk a little bit about the organization of the sympathetic nervous system. And some of this should be familiar because you should have done some of this in lab, right? So the sympathetic chain ganglia that ran down the spinal cord, either side, these bulges, right? These control the body wall, the thoracic cavity, and the head and limbs, right? So it's going to control a large chunk of the torso, right? Controlled through the sympathetic chain ganglion. Is everyone okay with where that is and what it does? Right? Now, we've got collateral ganglion, and I don't think you could see this in lab. This sits actually in front of the body of the vertebrae. Right? So not on the sides, it actually sits out in front of the body of the vertebrae. And this controls the abdominopelvic cavity. Abdominopelvic cavity. So here was our thoracic cavity, right? Here, lower region, is controlled by this collateral ganglion, abdominopelvic cavity. Now, the sympathetic nervous system also does something that's slightly different. Sympathetic nervous system uses the adrenal medulla as a third type of effector, right? So we did cardiac muscle, smooth muscle, we did also glands, right? The adrenal medulla, nice look at the name, what's this going to secrete? Epinephrine. It's going to dump epinephrine into the bloodstream. So this is a modified sympathetic ganglion, and it releases its neurotransmitter, its hormone, into the bloodstream. Okay? Now, if we look back over at our beautiful chart here, right? If I activated this pathway, what organ am I affecting? The heart. If I dump neurotransmitter into the bloodstream, what organ am I affecting? Hand, lungs, and reproductive organs, and right, it's traveling through the body, right? So this is kind of an on switch, right? You're going to affect everything. You dump epinephrine into the bloodstream, you're going to hit the heart, the lungs, blood vessels, right? You're going to target every organ in the body. But if we don't want to do that, we can use a neuronal pathway that is innervating a particular organ. Is okay with that? So these preganglionic, postganglionic, they're also going to innervate the lungs. So if we don't need to affect the heart, we can go in and affect the lungs. Okay? You can go and affect kidneys. Right? You can do a targeted response. Is this targeted at all? No. Okay? So let's take a little look at our sympathetic nervous system. Here's a sympathetic. We've got our ganglion here, right? We can go down and innervate a target, or we can dump our neurotransmitter into the bloodstream. Parasympathetic doesn't do that, right? You don't have this option of dumping neurotransmitter into the circulatory system. Parasympathetic doesn't have that. I'm going to affect the gland and it's going to flood the system. Okay? All right. So here are our three different ways the sympathetic nervous system affects. We've got our sympathetic chain ganglion, right? What did that affect? What cavity? Thoracic, or is it the thoracic cavity, right? Collateral ganglion, right? This collateral ganglion, we said sits in front of the body of the vertebrae. What area of the body did that affect? Abdominopelvic, right? And then we've got the adrenal medulla. What area of the body does the adrenal medulla affect? All of it, right? That's your on switch. You're going to flood the system, okay? Okay, so how is the adrenal medulla able to affect target cells throughout the body? It releases hormones into ducts within itself. It releases norepinephrine and epinephrine, and these act as hormones and travel through capillaries. The effects are shorter lasting than those produced by the sympathetic innervation. It has long postganglionic fibers. B, right, the second one. So it's going to release both epinephrine and norepinephrine. Epinephrine is adrenaline. This is going to be a derivative. It actually releases less of this than epinephrine, and it's going to travel through the capillaries in the body, flood the body with that. All right. So you're okay with sympathetic system, right? Three different ways to produce an effect, right? Sympathetic chain ganglion, right? Thoracic cavity. Collateral ganglion. Abdominopelvic cavity. Adrenal medulla. The entire body. You guys okay? Okay. Now we're going to look at the sympathetic system, right? We said the sympathetic system comes from the brain and sacral region, right? Different region, right? This was big thoracic, right? We had the whole thoracic and then the lumbar, right? Here we've got nuclei in the spinal cord of the sacral region, that's your S, and then nuclei in the brainstem, right, our cranial nerves. Okay, this is coming from the cranial region and the sacral region. It's going to go out and affect different parts of the body. Some of these we've talked about already. Cranial nerve 10, what's the name of that cranial nerve 10? Vagus, right? Vagus, visceral organs, neck, thoracic cavity, most of the abdominal cavity. So we said 70 to 75% of parasympathetic output goes through that cranial nerve. Okay, and then you've got a lot of glands, right? Tear producing glands, lacrimal glands, different salivary glands, and then the eye, right? So sympathetic did what to the eye? You're being attacked by a shark, pupils will dilate. Parasympathetic, the opposite effect. Pupils will constrict, right? You're going to curl up on the couch and watch football for 18 hours. Your pupils constrict, right? Because you want to cozy up and maybe doze off a little bit. Okay? All right, so this is kind of and I realize it looks somewhat overwhelming, but it's the innervation. So vagus nerve, right? 70–75% of output goes through that nerve, right? So it's innervating heart, lungs, liver, stomach, right? You see it coming into these organs, right? Huge, huge distribution of output, right? Small intestines, large intestines, pancreas, spleen, right? Some of these others, right, we said a lot of glands in the eye, and then the sacral region does some of the reproductive. Okay. All right, so here is, again, the sympathetic division. We had our sympathetic chain ganglion, our collateral ganglion, and the adrenal medulla, innervating, affecting different organs. Okay. The one thing I wanted to point out is that these nerves are sometimes bundled, and so you may see this as you read. The splachnic nerve, the superior mesenteric nerve, and the inferior mesenteric nerve are all part of the sympathetic output. So I just wanted to make sure that you saw that. Okay. So what we need to do is talk a little bit about how these two systems work together. Okay? And typically we did the eye, right? Parasympathetic does what to the pupil? Constrict. Sympathetic, dilate. Parasympathetic does what to heart rate? Slows it down. Sympathetic does what to heart rate? Increase it. Right? So typically the effects are opposite, right? Sympathetic is going to change visceral function in one direction, parasympathetic the opposite direction. Okay? Now, what autonomic tone is that both systems are always turned on at a low level. Right? So we're going to have both of these systems turned on at a low level. So we're going to turn both of them on. We're going to have this resting level of activity in both systems, right, at any given time. So parasympathetic system is turned on. What is that doing to heart rate? Slowing it down. Sympathetic nervous system is turned on. What is that doing to heart rate? Speeding it up. So what you want to be doing is thinking about this like a car, right? Don't do this in reality. But what you are doing is you are driving the car with one foot on the gas and one foot on the brake. Everyone get that? Right? So you're driving your car with one foot on the gas and one foot on the brake. Okay? Don't do that in reality. That's really bad for your car. But that's how your autonomic nervous system is working. Okay? One foot on the gas, sympathetic's on. One foot on the brake, parasympathetic's on. Slowing down the heart, speeding it up. Okay. Now, we're back to your car. You're driving your car, one foot on the gas, one foot on the brake. All right? I want you to make your car go faster. Right? Take your foot off the brake. I want you to make it go even faster. Put your foot down hard on the accelerator. Okay. So why is autonomic tone important? It gives your body two ways to refine organ function, right? You've got two ways to control heart rate now. If you want your heart rate to go up, what would you do? Well, we could take the parasympathetic nervous system, we could turn it off, or we could increase, beyond the resting level of activity, the sympathetic nervous system innervation and input into the heart. Does that make sense, everybody? Right? So we now have two ways to control the heart. Right? You can take your foot off the gas, or you can push harder on the accelerator. Okay? So you have a better level of control. Okay? All right. So what I want us to do here is go over the effects on the different organs. Okay? So we're going to go over these effects. Okay? And these are going to be important, particularly if you're in nursing or dental hygiene and are going to take pharmacology, right? So if you're taking pharmacology, you want to save all of this information and come back to it in pharmacology. All right, you'll get this maybe your second or third week of pharmacology. It will be all autonomic nervous system drugs. Okay, and so knowing what they do to each organ is going to be really important. All right, so I'm going to replicate the table up here. Right, sympathetic, parasympathetic. We've got heart, lungs, GI, eyes, kidneys, and skin. Okay? What does the sympathetic nervous system do to heart? It's going to increase heart rate. The other thing it does is it actually increases the force of contraction, right? So you're squeezing more blood out of the heart with each heartbeat. So it's going to increase force of contraction. Parasympathetic, opposite effect. Okay? So you're going to slow down the heart. It's not going to beat as forcefully. Okay? Now, what type of muscle are we affecting? Cardiac, right? Cardiac muscle, right? The cardiac muscle here. So I want you to kind of pay attention to that because we're going to compare it to the lungs. Do lungs have cardiac muscle? No. Okay. So what type of muscle are we dealing with when we affect lungs? Smooth muscle. Okay. Now, you're being attacked by a shark, right? Those are sympathetic. What do you want to, as far as airflow into the lungs? Increase it, right? So those tubes, what are we going to do to the diameter of the tubes, your bronchioles? Dilate. Dilate the bronchioles. Right? Now, to dilate the tubes, to make the tubes bigger, are you contracting muscle or relaxing muscle? Relaxing. So up here, what were we doing to cardiac muscle? Causing it to contract here, causing it to dilate. Right? So don't set your heart on learning this using that tool, right? Because you can do different things depending on where you're at. Okay, that's going to be important to remember. Parasympathetic, we said typically you have an opposite effect, right? So parasympathetic, we're going to constrict. Okay. GI tract, right? What are we going to do to food motility through the GI tract? Sympathetic. Slow it down. What about parasympathetic? Speed it up. What kind of muscle do you have? Smooth, right? Right? Here we're decreasing contractions, here we're increasing contractions. Okay. With eyes, right, you actually have two different sets of muscles. Arm over here. We've got these ones. We've got some radial tires. Right? Never mind. Alright. This one looks like a sun, right? When these contract, your pupil will dilate. And then you've got the ones that are concentric circles. When these contract, pupils will constrict. So, which division innervates the circular? Parasympathetic. That means the sympathetic. And these are smooth muscle. Right? So smooth muscle, eyes, right? Dilate pupil. Constrict pupil. So we were dealing with rest and digest, right? And we said what goes in has to come out, right? So with the kidneys, right, what you're going to do is you're going to deal with eliminating urine. And there's kind of a two-part step to that. You have a sphincter, right, that you have to open, right? So if you're making a sphincter larger, you're relaxing that muscle, and then the bladder has to contract. So the two-part kind of sequence with this. You're going to contract the bladder and relax the sphincter. Here, bladder relaxes, sphincter contracts. Okay, so urine, leaking. Sympathetic, the one thing that doesn't match up nicely, sympathetic causes you to sweat. Parasympathetic doesn't really have much to do with skin and sweat glands.
What did the sympathetic do to the kidneys? Bladder relax?
The bladder relaxes and that sphincter contracts, so you're not allowing urine to leak. Right? The one piece that I don't have up here are blood vessels. So I'm going to add it to the bottom. Blood vessels. Right? Your sympathetic nervous system controls blood vessels. Right? Causes the smooth muscle to constrict. Right? So here you're going to decrease the diameter of blood vessels. Okay. So you're making the container that holds the blood smaller. Okay. Constricting the blood vessels. All right. You guys okay? With different effects on the different systems. All right, so what we need to do now is talk about the receptors on these effectors. We've got all the effects, right? So what we need to do is we need to be able to say, okay, what kind of receptors do we have there that are causing these effects, right? So what we're going to do is we're going to talk about cholinergic receptors, right? Cholinergic, we're dealing with acetylcholine as the neurotransmitter, and there were 3 different places we had acetylcholine being released by neurons, right? We had it being released by our preganglionic neurons in both the parasympathetic and sympathetic nervous system. Do you remember what receptor I said was on our postganglionic neurons? Nicotinic, right? So nicotinic is located at all autonomic synapses, right, between our preganglionic and our postganglionic neuron, first neuron and second neuron. At every autonomic synapse, you have nicotinic cholinergic receptors. Okay? It's also on skeletal muscle, our neuromuscular junction. Right? Now, our muscarinic receptors, we said, are located on our effectors. These are parasympathetic receptors. So you're going to have muscarinic receptors on the heart. You're going to have muscarinic receptors on the lungs. You're going to have muscarinic receptors, kidneys, right? When those receptors bind to acetylcholine, right, you will produce these effects. Everyone okay with that? So it's the binding of these receptors to acetylcholine to produce our parasympathetic effects. Heart, lung, kidney. Everyone okay? Okay. This is our postganglionic neuron innervating our effector. Smooth muscle, cardiac muscle, and gland. Here's our preganglionic neurons innervating our postganglionic neuron. Did I get your question, or did I mess that up?
The preganglionic
neuron releases acetylcholine in both the sympathetic and parasympathetic divisions. And it's going to bind to nicotinic receptors on our postganglionic neurons in both systems. So those parts are exactly the same. postganglionic neuron. We said one releases acetylcholine, that's this one. The other one releases epinephrine, norepinephrine, and dopamine. We haven't gotten to that part yet. Okay, so do you have muscarinic receptors on your heart? Yes. Do you have muscarinic receptors on the smooth muscle of your GI tract? Do you have muscarinic receptors on the smooth muscles of your bronchioles? Yes. So they're in all of these effectors. Right? All of these effectors. You guys okay? All right. Now, adrenergic receptors are where we get a little bit complicated because they're not all the same. Okay? But they're not too bad. Okay? Not too bad. Right? Our adrenergic receptors are going to bind norepinephrine and epinephrine. Right? Do you remember epinephrine was the big one that was released from our adrenal medulla? Right? Norepinephrine is our primary neurotransmitter released from our postganglionic neurons. Okay, there are multiple types of receptors. Okay? And these differ based on location. Based on location. So we have beta 1 and beta 2. How many hearts do you have? How many lungs do you have? 2. So beta 1 is found where? Beta 2 is found where? Okay? So use that to remember where you find them. Okay? Beta 1 adrenergic receptors are located on the heart. What happens when norepinephrine binds to beta 1 receptors on the heart? Right? Increases contractions, force of contractions, and heart rate. What happens when norepinephrine binds to beta 2 adrenergic receptors located on the smooth muscle of the lung? It relaxes them, right? Because you're going to dilate those tubes to make the airflow increase. Okay? Is everyone okay with that? You guys okay? Alpha 1 receptors are located on blood vessels. Located on blood vessels. Okay? When norepinephrine binds to alpha 1 located on blood vessels, what happens to blood vessels? Right? They constrict and decrease the diameter of the blood vessels. So, for example, when you go to the dentist's office, typically they gave you lidocaine. Lidocaine, we said, blocks sodium channels, right, to stop action potentials going down pain pathways. They also give you epinephrine. Why do they give you epinephrine mixed with lidocaine? What's the advantage of giving you epinephrine? Keep you from bleeding, right? If your blood vessels are constricted in that area, right, it's going to decrease the blood flow going through the blood vessels that have been severed during whatever procedure you have going on. Does that make sense to everybody? Right? So typically in local anesthetics, they will give you epinephrine with it to capture that local anesthetic in that region, right? Tighten up those blood vessels, make sure you're not going out and emphasizing large areas. You want to keep it in that region and it decreases blood loss. Okay? You guys okay? All right. Okay? So, key points to remember. Beta 1 receptors, if it binds epinephrine or norepinephrine, that increases heart muscle contraction. Binding to beta 2 decreases smooth muscle contraction in the lungs. It's going to dilate the bronchioles. So you have different effects, right? Different effects. Okay, so, here's a question for you guys, think about it. Could epinephrine, if I gave you all epinephrine, could that be used to control asthma? Yes, right? So it could. What is it going to do to the lungs? Open up those bronchioles to increase airflow. So asthma is when you have decreased airflow into the lungs. Epinephrine could be used to control that. Now, what receptors does epinephrine bind to? Does it bind to beta 1? Yes. Does it bind to beta 2?
Yes.
Yes. Does it bind to alpha 1? Yes. Right? Binds to beta 1, beta 2, alpha 1. So, will epinephrine used to control asthma affect the heart? What is it going to do to the heart? Right? Increase constriction, increase heart rate. Right? What is it going to do to blood vessels? constrict them, right? So that's going to do what to blood flow? Make it hard to, it's going to slow it down, right? So tell me about your asthmatic patient. Are they going to be happy? What are they going to suffer from? High heart rate, high blood pressure, right? So are they going to be able to breathe well? Yeah, right? They're going to be able to breathe well, but they're going to be hypertensive and tachycardic, right? So would you want to use epinephrine to control asthma? No. Is everyone okay with what I've just done? Right? Epinephrine will bind to beta 1, beta 2, and alpha 1. It will fix the lungs, right? It will open up those bronchioles, allow you to breathe. But it's also going to affect the heart and the blood vessels, which is going to make someone tachycardic, rapid heart rate, right? My heart is racing, and give them high blood pressure, hypertension. Okay? Okay, beta blockers. How does a beta blocker mediate decreased high blood pressure? This drug aids in parasympathetic stimulation. Is that true or false? What kind of receptors do we use in parasympathetic division? Muscarinic, right? So is a beta blocker going to affect the muscarinic receptor? No, right? Does a beta blocker decrease blood volume? No. The drug prevents sympathetic stimulation. Going to block what type of receptors? Beta 1 and 2. Is it blocking sympathetic stimulation? Yes. Okay, so it's going to block the sympathetic stimulation. What does sympathetic innervation do to the heart rate? Increases, right? What is it due to force of contraction? And what's going to happen if we block the beta receptors on the heart? Decrease heart rate, decrease force of contraction. Okay. All right, so kind of we need to wrap this up with a little bit of control, right? So we've got several different things that control autonomic nervous system function. I've got medulla oblongata up there. Why is the medulla oblongata important? Right. Input to the autonomic nervous system. What two centers are located in the medulla oblongata? Heart and cardiovascular centers, and respiratory, right? Cardiac and respiratory. So it's got to be part of the autonomic nervous system, right? And we said if your medulla oblongata is damaged and not functioning, what happens? You die because you have heart rates and you are not breathing, right? So this has to play a role, right? Cardiovascular centers, respiratory centers. We said that the autonomic nervous system is headquartered where? In the hypothalamus, right? Visceral sensory information is coming in, visceral motor going out. So that's where it's going to be headquartered. It's going to adjust to the sensory information that is collected, right? And then the cerebral cortex, that's your higher functioning. If you get mad or upset or you're thoughtful, that will affect autonomic nervous system function as well. So this is your higher brain function feeding into the autonomic nervous system. Okay. Now, there are visceral reflexes, right? We've done some somatic reflexes, right? Patellar tendon reflex, right? You hit your knee, kick, right? There are visceral reflex responses as well. So you are going to have the autonomic nervous system play into that, right? Because the autonomic nervous system is the motor control of the visceral organs. So if you have a decrease in blood pressure, your blood pressure goes down, right? That information will be sent to the hypothalamus, right? It will trigger a cardioacceleratory reflex, right? That is going to increase heart rate and increase force of contraction. Is that the autonomic nervous system? Yeah. Which division? Sympathetic, right? So you're going to have sympathetic outflow as part of this reflex response. It's coordinated by cardiac centers in the medulla oblongata. Right, does that make sense, everybody? So you're going to reverse the effects. Too low blood pressure will make it go up, right? Cardioacceleratory reflex. Okay. So, what I've got for you on your sheet, right? Autonomic nervous system worksheet. What I want you to do is I want you to work in the groups on this, right? On this. This will make sure that you understand both the anatomy, the neurotransmitter used, and the functions. So what I'd like you to do is go ahead and work on it, and then we're going to round back up and do it together. Because we have 20 minutes, so that's actually quite a bit. We're going to divvy out the questions and have the different groups answer the questions as we go through, okay? So we'll do, so I'm going to walk around and tell you which question your group has. There's 7. Okay, so you guys are going to do question 1, okay? Are you question 2? Alright, you guys are question 3. You guys question 4. You guys are question 5. Alright. And you guys are going to do question 6. You can go ahead and do the other ones as well, but we'll go over it all this time. Okay, well.
Yeah, like everything that she's got up there.
I thought it would be the heart and kidney.
Pretty much everything she's got up there.
You doing okay?
Yeah.
Yeah, but don't just do your question. If you're done with yours, go on to some of the others. Let me know, maybe I'll have everybody back there. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. No one get hit about 1. So about that. So you'll do that one about the water. Except for Sundays are not really. Make sure everybody's on board. So the idea is that once you sort through weekends are just from the floor. You come on Monday and get all the crap, but there's pre-gaming and both. Synthetic and parasympathetic. So we did the short synthetic. Synthetic pre-game third, and then the really long amniotic. And we had the opposite
Fridays are long pre-ganglionic neuron. Sunday dies down, Monday pulls hell, and then they're like, I don't feel like going to work today. My coworker, she coworker did. They realize that producing there, so so that's what they're going to call for toe pumps, blood clots on the stub their toe. Oh, yeah.
Are you doing good?
Oh, we got it.
You got it?
Yeah.
Awesome. Yes. You guys doing all right?
Yeah.
Very good. So there are two questions, one that's draw the preganglionic, draw the ganglion, draw the postganglionic neuron. For both the sympathetic and parasympathetic, you definitely want to do those questions, all right? So you definitely want to do those questions because those are going to tell you whether you understand or not. And so if you guys are done with your question, you're welcome to write it up there on the chalkboard. We'll go over it.
We're trying to figure out where we're a little lost. Well, who's drawing?
And my shoes are
I
wet.
haven't drawn. You speak in English, right? I'm good on that.
All right.
Want me to do all of these and then all those
Yeah, just do all of them. You can simply list your answers kind of down the side. Right.
The location.
So they're everywhere. They're in all there's like
And then like Thursday, like I'm sorry.
Alright, I will draw for you. Alright, let's go.
We better get her a call.
Alright, we're going to go through this, right? And so what you really do need to be able to do are those drawings, or however you deal with them, but you need to be able to do the pathways. So what we're going to do first, we're going to go through the answers, and I want to make sure that your pathways are correct, okay? And we're going to go through the pathways. So number one, what effectors are innervated by the autonomic nervous system? So we've got visceral organs, right, or internal organs, all of these, heart, lungs, GI tract, eyes, skin, blood vessels. So what type of tissue are found in these organs? Cardiac, smooth, muscle, and gland. Right? So those are our effectors. Those are what we are effecting, right? We're going to produce effects in these organs, right? So anytime you see effector, you are thinking what organ, right? You're thinking what am I telling this to do, right? I'm going to control the heart. I'm going to control the lungs. What are you controlling? Is an effector, okay? Number two, draw a preganglionic neuron, a ganglion, and a postganglionic neuron for the sympathetic nervous system, okay? So this is excellent. Remember, the sympathetic nervous system had our short preganglionic neuron, right? Do you remember what region this preganglionic neuron originates from? Spinal cord. So which part of the spinal cord? Thoracic and lumbar. So this is starting out here, thoracic and lumbar region, right? We've got a preganglionic neuron. Our ganglion is where our preganglionic neuron is synapses with our postganglionic neuron. So that's the ganglion. And then we've got our postganglionic neuron in the sympathetic nervous system. That's the really long one, right? And it's going to go to the heart, the lungs, right? Whatever you're affecting, it's going to truck out to whatever the effector is. You guys okay so far? All right. Then I ask, what is the neurotransmitter released by our preganglionic neuron, right? And we said that's the same in both systems, right? It's going to release acetylcholine. It's going to release acetylcholine. And then I say, okay, well, what does that bind to, right? What does the acetylcholine bind to? The type of receptors that are located here, and I'm going to draw them out on the sides. These are nicotinic receptors, right? Because they also bind to nicotine. That's where they get their name. Help you remember the name, right? So we have an action potential that is started in our preganglionic neuron at the axon hillock, just like every other neuron we've talked about. Action potential travels down the axon, reaches the synaptic terminal, causing acetylcholine to be released. Acetylcholine then binds to the nicotinic receptors, right? That triggers an action potential in our postganglionic neuron. Action potential travels down to the end of our postganglionic neuron. What type of neurotransmitter is released, right? Norepinephrine. Right? Then I ask, well, what type of receptors does norepinephrine bind? And we have adrenergic receptors. So we have our adrenergic receptors located on our target, on our effector, heart, lungs, skin, right? These are adrenergic receptors. Now, what type of adrenergic receptors are there? There's 3 different types. Beta 1, beta 2, alpha 1, okay? If this target is the heart, which receptor are you going to have? How many hearts do you have? Beta 1, right? If this is a blood vessel, what receptor are you going to have? Alpha 1. If this target is the lung, what? Beta 2. All right, are you guys okay with that? Okay. So this is located, these receptors are located, smooth muscle, cardiac muscle, glands, right? We know specifically that the heart has beta 1, beta 2 is in the lungs, blood vessels, alpha 1. You guys okay? All right, I'm going to draw the parasympathetic now. These are the same questions, all right? So we have our, and I'm not going to draw it as pretty as that. Right? We have our preganglionic neuron. Is this a short neuron or a long neuron? Long. Where do our preganglionic neurons originate?
Brain.
Brain and sacrum. Okay? They start out in those regions. Okay? They're going to synapse at the ganglion. And then we've got our postganglionic neuron. Okay? So if we have an action signal triggered in our preganglionic neuron of our parasympathetic nervous system, it's going to travel down the axon to the synaptic terminal. What neurotransmitter will be released by that neuron? Acetylcholine. Okay? What receptor will it bind to? Nicotinic. Nicotinic, right? So this is the same in both systems. I'm running over time, sorry. So we've got acetylcholine binding to our nicotinic receptor. Action potential travels down our postganglionic neuron. What neurotransmitter will be released? Acetylcholine. What's it going to bind to? Muscarinic receptors. Where do you find muscarinic receptors? Smooth muscle, cardiac muscle, and glands. Heart, lung, kidneys, whatever. Right? Smooth muscle, cardiac muscle, glands. Find muscarinic receptors. Okay, 4, we have a drug. It's targeting alpha 1. So it's targeting blood vessels. It's going to open those blood vessels. It's going to be used to treat high blood pressure. Okay? 5, Carl stung by a bee. His throat begins to swell. His respiratory passages constrict. Are we going to use epinephrine or acetylcholine to bind or to open up or to reverse the effects? You would use epinephrine because it's going to open up airways. You know people who carry EpiPens with them, right? That's because of those effects of epinephrine. All right. 6, bronchioles will open up because you're using epinephrine from the adrenal medulla. It still has the same effects. Beta blockers decrease heart rate, decrease force of contraction. I'm going to let you mull over this over the weekend, right? And I'm going to have a whole other set of drugs, and we will talk about what you would use them for just to make sure we've got it locked down. But these pictures, hugely important, okay? You need to know receptors and the neurotransmitters that are in use. Sorry for running late. 7 beta blockers.